said, poverty is the mother of crime.
Well, I guess I would look at it a little bit differently, because the banks are publicly traded companies, and many of these banks, when you look at pension funds, RSPs, RESPs, things along those lines, the banks make money and then they pay it out to shareholders. It doesn't just, disappear.
Well, $24 billion just disappeared from the Canadian pension plan. But that didn't stop David Denison, president and CEO of CPP, and his executives from pocketing millions of dollars in bonuses. Or how about the $40 billion that just disappeared from the Quebec pension company?
People like to say, oh, the bad banks, they're making too much money. But it actually, in the big scheme of things, it's a good thing that companies make money. That's how the whole system is based. That's how people's retirements, their investments, that's how it works.
So when our banks are doing bad, our pensions are at risk. And when our banks are doing good, our pensions are still at risk. Gotcha. Why don't we just fix the monetary system? I'm sure all the time, work, and trillions of dollars Canadians would save would more than compensate for the banks not screwing everyone over, just to maybe get a pension. And in return, the quality of life for Canadians would improve tremendously. We would have more time to spend with our families, more time for our hobbies, and all the other things we love in life. And if you're a workaholic, you'll be glad to know that you'd be receiving more rewards for your labor, since we won't be slaving over usury debts anymore.
From what you're saying is that we could have a country that is the most highly advanced country in the world, because we wouldn't have it then if we took these issues into consideration and tried to make some changes.
That's right. And if your concerns are for the environment or underprivileged countries, imagine the differences you'd be able to make with billions of more tax dollars a year going to that cause. But the reality is, we're a sinking ship. So how on earth can we save others if we can't save ourselves?
If I were running this country, I think you could pretty much say to the banks, well, we're not paying you back. Like, if you don't like it, you get the out of the country.
Yeah. So where am I going with all of this? Well, if we take a look at the preamble from the Bank of Canada Act, it states that the bank exists to regulate credit and currency in the best interests of the economic life of the nation. But since we own the bank, and it obviously isn't operating in the best interests of the nation or its owners, there's clearly a conflict of interest, and this needs to be looked at very seriously. Because every country uses the same sort of banking system, and this system is bankrupting all the countries that use it, the governments of the world are surrendering themselves to the international banking institutions. The World Bank, IMF, and BIS. These institutions have a history for supporting dozens of military dictatorships with billions of dollars in loans, and also wreak havoc on developed and underdeveloped countries, including our own.
So, for instance, why do we have a healthcare crisis now? We have a healthcare crisis in 2009 because in 1994, the International Monetary Fund wrote a report to the Government of Canada that said, and at that point we were in debt. Remember, this was right before Paul Martin's slaying of the deficit.
So yeah, it would be like 600, 500 billion.
It was, and the IMF's report was, okay, Canada's not, we're not saying you're a basket case, but our view of your financial viability, and that of course translates into how the bond raters in New York take our financial viability. We would think, we think you'd do better if you did the following things. Stop student bursaries and convert them to interest-bearing student loans. Cut the CBC, cut the NFB, cut Via Rail, reduce the number of hospital beds you've got. Now, all of those things happened. There was never any democratic debate about it. We lost 20% of our hospital beds in Canada in the year and a half after the IMF report to the Government of Canada. But nobody even really knows it happened. The World Health Organization knows it happened because they've actually done reports on Canada as one of the only modern democracies to have deliberately slashed its health care provision in order to slay a deficit. And it's proven, the World Health Organization studies prove that in doing that, we actually made our health care situation, not only is the health care worse, but the costs of health care went up because people couldn't access timely health care when they needed it before it became a disaster. So
But who was who actually made those cuts?
Paul Martin. We were told by the IMF that certain things should be slashed. Now, why couldn't a government say to the IMF, go fly a kite? Well, simple reason. Once you have indebtedness to a foreign country or foreign banks, and your credit rating really matters. If you drop from a AAA credit rating to a AA credit rating, as you guys know, your interest rates are going to go up on the debt you have. So you'll be spending more and more and more out of the federal treasury or in the provincial treasury. And that's why Bob Rae, by the way, as Premier of Ontario, didn't keep his campaign promises. Didn't keep them because he got to Ontario and discovered that if he did the things he promised, bond raiders in New York, anonymous people, nothing to do with Canadian democracy, would make a decision to drop Ontario's credit rating such that any promises Rae was trying to keep would come from a smaller and smaller amount of an available budget, because more of his budget would have to go to paying interest on the debt. So they have you over a barrel. So once you have a debt, particularly to external sources, now why, if you have a debt to the Bank of Canada, it doesn't matter. If you have a debt that is external, that the rest of the world is looking at, how large is your deficit? How large is your debt? How much trouble are you in? I mean, look at the United States right now. It's the biggest debtor country in the world. China holds most of the paper.
Despite of all of this, Jim Flaherty, like his predecessors, is bowing down to the World Bank institutions, which will continue to surrender our currency to international bankers, people who none of us have ever voted for. And as we've learned from our own Prime Minister Mackenzie King,
once a nation parts with the control of its currency and credit, it matters not who makes that nation's laws.
Pope Benedict XVI is calling for a new world financial order. In the third encyclical of his pontificate, Benedict denounced the profit-at-all-cost mentality of the globalized economy, and he lamented that greed brought about the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. The document, entitled Charity and Truth, was released just hours before the G8 summit gets underway in Italy.
And at the G8 summit, the President of Russia presented what he called a united future world currency. He told reporters, "Here it is, you can see it, you can touch it."
The pontiff stressed that he is not opposed to a globalized economy, saying that if done correctly, it has unprecedented potential to redistribute wealth around the world.
I don't know how many economics classes the Pope has attended, but I can assure you, these are the kinds of crucial steps necessary to establish a one-world government, which last time I checked conflicts with Canada being an independent sovereign country. In closing, we must regain control of our country's currency from the private banks, both domestic and international. If our governments can make the laws that give away our currency, then they can make the laws that take it back. And while we're at it, maybe the Bank of Canada's logo should finally be changed to a Canadian maple leaf. After all, a good mother knows when to let her child leave the nest. Sorry, Britain. And if we truly love our country and our children, we'll do something now to save them from a life of debt slavery. I mean, you wouldn't want to borrow money from the mafia and leave the debt to your kids to deal with. We always hear about transparency in government, but we never really see it. And if we did, it would probably scare the living hell out of us. How many of you can identify this man? His name is Paul Desmarais, but you can call him the Canadian Monopoly Guy. His family owns and operates Power Corp, one of the largest corporations in Canada. Power Corp owns a dozen companies ranging from financial institutions to newspapers and media, oil and energies, and more, that produce revenues of $24 billion a year and several $100 billion in assets. But his most powerful investments by far are not in world resources, but politicians. Well, what do you think a man's intentions are when he owns a monopolizing corporation called Power Corp? Just some of his employees consisted of three of Canada's longest-running prime ministers in recent years: Pierre Trudeau, Brian Mulroney, and Jean Chrétien. As a matter of fact, Paul Desmarais' son, André Desmarais, now co-owner of Power Corp along with his brother, is actually married to Jean Chrétien's daughter, France. So you can only imagine how close these two powerful families are with many years of history. Other employees for Paul Desmarais are former premiers of Ontario and Quebec: William Davis, John Roberts, and Daniel Johnson. Or how about John Ray, brother of Liberal NDP Bob Ray? John is currently Executive Vice President for Power Corp and was longtime advisor to Jean Chrétien, as well as his campaign chairman. There's also former President of Power Corp, Maurice Strong. After becoming a successful businessman with Power Corp and Paul Desmarais, he was able to bridge himself from business to politics with his new circle of friends. He became first Executive Director of the UN Environment Program and President of the World Federation of UN Associations. Remember, this is a businessman. Some of Maurice's friends include the likes of the World Bank President, James Wolfensohn, former Vice President of the US, Al Gore, and former Swedish Prime Minister and member of the Global Governance Institution, Ingvar Carlsson. And last, but certainly not least, Paul Martin. Paul became president and CEO of one of Power Corp's subsidiary companies, the Canadian Steamship Line, which was eventually sold to him in the 1980s. During his ownership of the Canadian Steamship Line, Martin changed the flags on the ships in order to operate shell companies in overseas countries like Singapore and the Bahamas, where he could exploit the laws to profit from cheap labor, lower environmental standards, and paying virtually no income tax on revenues of several hundred millions of dollars. After giving his steamship company to his kids, in 2003 he was fit to become Prime Minister of Canada and tell everyone else to pay income tax. And in January 2004, the Canadian federal government revealed that Martin's Steamship Line Company had received over $100 million in federal government contracts, grants, and loans since Martin became finance minister in 1993. This was the same time he was cutting taxpayers' dollars to our schools and hospitals in order to slave the inescapable debt. You can bet with gifts like these, Martin would have to remain pretty loyal to the man who established his family fortune and political success, Mr. Monopoly Man. I mean, Paul Desmarais. And how many of you even knew his name? Some of Paul Desmarais' other friends include the Bush family, the Clinton family, and the President of France, Nicolas Sarkozy. When you consider the circle of friends surrounding Paul Desmarais, it's not hard to imagine how government corruption can set in. But it's our government officials who should never be this infatuated with making money and powerful corporate allies. And yet, sadly, we see exactly that. And this is just the tip of the iceberg when you consider these next things. Bilderbergers. Not Build-A-Burger, but members of the Bilderberg Group. The Bilderberg Groups consist of some of the largest visible corporate, political, and royalty members of the world. They hold their meetings annually, usually in remote places where there's no media allowed, at least to broadcast what goes on, because there's plenty of members of the media attending the meetings, such as Chairman of the Board of the Washington Post, major media outlet owner Rupert Murdoch, and news anchor Peter Jennings. Some of the other members include Presidents of the United States, such as Bill Clinton and Gerald Ford. Bankers attend, of course: World Bank President Wolfensohn, Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Timothy Geithner, President of the Federal Reserve, and somehow became U.S. Secretary of Treasury. He looks confused about it too. That would be like the President of RBC becoming our Finance Minister. It just reeks of corruption. Dozens of corporate giants sit in as well, such as the CEO and Chairman of Google, the CEO of IBM, and the chairman of Nokia and Shell. And who could forget the hard-working royal families? Prince Charles of England and Queen Sophia of Spain. Both go to Bilderberg. And wouldn't you know it, Pierre Trudeau, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, and Stephen Harper have also all attended.
What is your opinion on these secretive meetings that I hear about of the Bill